Welcome to the Talking Precision Medicine podcast, brought to you by Genialis. I'm your host, Raphael Rosengarten, CEO and co-founder of Genialis, the RNA biomarker company. On this podcast, we discuss the future of healthcare and health technology, and how advances in data and data science are fueling the next industrial revolution. If you have not already, please subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more information on Genialis and our unique approach to AI-driven precision medicine, please visit our website at www.genialis.com. That's www.genialis.com. Now, on to the show. What a pleasure to welcome today's guest, Ryan Fukushima, Chief Operating Officer of TempusAI. Not only has Ryan helped build Tempus brick by brick from the earliest days, he is also CEO of Pathos AI, a biotech company using real-world data and artificial intelligence to develop true precision medicines. I don't know how he juggles it all, but unless he's been hiding out these last few years, Tempus has become a household name in our industry, completing a highly successful IPO last year. But no need to take my word for it. Come on in and have a listen. It's my pleasure to be joined today by Ryan Fukushima. Ryan is Chief Operating Officer of TempusAI and also CEO of Pathos, a new biotechnology company spun out from Tempus. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Raph.
Well, let's start with the first one. I mean, most people who listen to this hopefully surely know what TempusAI is, or at least have heard of it, been in the news a lot. But maybe you can tell us in your own words, what is Tempus? What's your mission? And, what's the work all about?
Yeah, so Tempus AI, we formed it about almost 10 years ago, and really we've been focused on solving this fundamental data problem that exists in precision medicine, largely connecting molecular data at scale, connected with longitudinal outcomes and things like imaging, so that you can usher in this new future of AI-enabled diagnostics. Is that if you assemble those requisite data modalities, you could start rethinking what a diagnostic could and should be in the sense of not just thinking about it as a molecular test, but thinking about it as a broader category in terms of how could you rethink things like screening, how could you rethink things like treatment selection or even monitoring disease. These are all things where you can use the various tools that are readily available or the data that's kind of routinely being generated in clinical workflow to really aid doctors in making the most personalized and optimal decision for his or her patient. And so we've been on that journey now, doing both, building up a lab, one of the largest next generation sequencing labs in cancer today, at least in the US, and focused on not only doing that type of testing, but in parallel, organizing clinical information connected to those tests and also longitudinal outcomes, where we now have integrations with over 2,000 health systems to really build that sort of data, those data modalities together, so that as we analyze each patient case, the future of patient care will be enhanced as a result of that sort of collective information. And so we're not only solving treatment selection problems or challenges of today, but with this data set, we've been fortunate enough to be able to work on some of the novel treatments of tomorrow. And this is why our data business and our testing business is so tightly linked, is that we can really address various challenges in precision medicine by building this kind of connected data network and solving that data problem. But yeah, we're just getting started. It's 10 years in. We've had the good fortune of working with almost half of the oncologists in the US, and we want to continue going.
That's incredible. And you've given us a lot to unpack over the rest of the show. Let's go back, 10 years ago. Where did the idea to kind of upend diagnostics come from? So I'm trying to remember sort of the state of play 10 years ago. There was some next generation sequencing at the time, probably of the DNA variety, but mostly just measuring mutations in kind of a limited number related to things we already thought we knew. What was the vision or the motivation to say, hey, we need to actually measure all the things and collect a lot more information to make it actionable?
Yeah, it started with Eric Lakofsky's personal sort of experiences with cancer care with his wife's case, which he talks publicly about. And so as he was going through it with his wife's case, what was ironic is I was going through it with my mother's case with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer. And I think both of us shared this kind of collective sort of belief that too often the data wasn't connected in terms of how are similar patients responding to the existing therapies of today, but also the diagnostics or the tests that were available to those types of cancer cases. We're generally thinking about how do you develop the smallest test, not necessarily the broadest test. That's not necessarily the testing company's fault. That's just their business model, right? Their business model is based on the volume of test times the margin, operating margin of that test. And so, naturally speaking, most companies try to optimize that, meaning reduce the cost or not make it bigger because that's against the operating margin of the business. And so when we face that, I think one of the things got insanely focused on, which is, well, how do you build a business model that is actually incentivized to not just build better and more comprehensive diagnostics, but is incentivized by doing so to advance the next set of treatments of tomorrow, and that's kind of how we got fixated on, okay, well, if we solve this data problem, what's great about it is that you can enhance a better testing offering, but also you can create a business that really didn't exist, or most diagnostic companies didn't really build data business historically. And so we were crazy enough and bold enough to try to do both. And in hindsight, it actually has worked very well for us. But what it required, though, is it required us to do two things at the same time, right? Building a very competitive testing offering, competitive in terms of operational capacities to be able to turn around these results in a very short order, but also continue to advance the breadth of that test more over time, right? And if you can do those things, you could start that flywheel, which is around building diagnostics connected to clinical data, enriches the experience that we can provide to physicians, and that actually brings more physicians to the platform. So it creates this virtuous cycle, which allows the whole customer base to benefit from that. And so that's kind of playing out, and that's where we got started.
Yeah, there's sort of a famous conundrum in building any kind of marketplace, right? There's the cold start challenge. How do you get those first users to come and take your test, given that you probably didn't have, you could sequence a genome, but could you tell them all the information they wanted to know on day one? How did those early conversations go? Were there some notable early adopters among physicians or healthcare organizations that really allowed you guys to grow your legs?
Yeah, and I think that the concept that we were underscoring or focused on, this concept of building a learning health system or this ability to learn over time wasn't novel, right? But pulling it off and the execution of it was truly differentiated because many weren't doing it at true scale. And so as we were talking with health systems, I think that since the concept was something that they've been thinking about frequently or have been thinking about it historically, we got buy-in, at least theoretically. Like there's a yes, I want to be part of that. Now, actually pulling it off and saying, okay, well, here's what it requires in order to do that for this particular cancer population. You're going to have to do EMR integrations. You're going to have to do the work to pull the data to then organize it, but also bring it back in. And so I think what was funny about when we got started is that to many, we appeared out of nowhere. We came out of nowhere. People didn't really hear about us. But what was happening in the first 2 or 3 years is we were talking to, I don't know, probably like 50 to 70 different health systems about this concept of that this is what we're going to the technology that we're building to bring not just comprehensive diagnostics to your cancer patient populations, but organizing this data so that those diagnostics better, even better over time. And so it really took a few hospitals that really leaned into it, where they weren't just bought in, at least ideologically, but they were willing to put in the work to say, yes, I'm going to spend IT resources to be able to make this happen and see what it could look like. And, I think with those first two health systems, they were taking a leap with us because we were a kind of an unknown commodity at that point. And so, I think what was conventionally thought of, or what was, I think a lot of the experienced healthcare folks that have told us is that it was going to be a mountain too high to climb. Getting health systems to really do that IT work with EMR integrations and sending data around, that was just not possible, or at least wasn't thought it was possible. And so, luckily, both Eric and I are not from this industry, and so we kind of didn't know any better, I guess, if you could say, or we really believed that we could do it. And I talk about it in one of my blog posts is that it's actually an overlooked superpower. Is that when you're a little bit naive and a little bit crazy, and you have determination, right? In some cases, you can do things that many thought that were hard and near impossible to do. And so all it took was, I think, those first two health systems really buy in, and then you can start showing versus telling people of like what's possible, right? That's what starts to build get past that cold starting problem.
As you and Eric had come to this with your own sort of personal motivations, how much were you thinking about the patient at the center of the business, the data model, the execution model? I mean, you obviously have to convince healthcare systems and physicians to order tests and someone to pay for it, et cetera. But patients are giving up their data in hopes of getting better treatment, in hopes of something. But Tempus had a vision of using that data to create this much bigger ecosystem and ultimately business and products. Kind of where did the patient factor into that? How much did you have to think about a new model for consent and that kind of sort of detail at the beginning?
I think as going through it with my mom's case, when you're faced with that situation, you really just want to do everything you can to give yourself or to give my mom's case to give my mom sort of the best chances of getting a more personalized option. And we didn't mind whether sharing that information was going to help the next lung cancer patient. It's actually, I would actually want to do that rather than not just be okay with it. It's something that I would want, because once you go through it, you don't really want others to kind of face that similar situation or challenges. And so it really comes down to, okay, well, what are you going to do with the data? Right. And that's why what's core to our business is that even though it's de-identified clinical information and things of that nature, the whole point of building the data business was so that we can help pharma companies design better trials that don't fail and ultimately bring more options to patients. Because that's what you need, especially in stage 4 lung cancer at that time, 10 years ago, you needed more options. If you didn't have Alpros or EGFR, like what personalized option did you really have? And it's evolved since then, but our whole, I would say, mission was, could we use the data to accelerate that even faster? And thankfully there has been more treatment options to those patients 10 years in, but we believe that there can be even more, the next 10 years. So the consent model was largely already existed, especially in things like cancer or oncology, given that the reason why we were using the data was to help design trials with pharma companies, but also bring those trials to the patients that could benefit from it, right? Rather than, I'd say other different data businesses, especially when you think about like consumer ads or advertising models, that starts to be a little bit less appealing to a person that's giving up their data. I don't want to be advertised to as a cancer patient. That's not what I'm signing up for. But if my data can help either myself have more options or the next patient have more options, there's no better way of using the data than those two circumstances.
No, that resonates a lot. So I want to fast forward then, 10 years or so. Tempus went public recently as Tempus AI. So the name is updated a bit from Tempus Labs. And it's known, at least by those in the industry, as one of the best, if not the best, sources of aggregated real world data in oncology. And that includes multimodal data. So molecular data from the genome, from the transcriptome, pathology data, health records, et cetera. But clearly I'm glossing over, 10 years of blood, sweat, and tears. Are there any sort of milestones or kind of turning points that reflecting on, kind of felt like, yeah, we sounded crazy at first, but this might just work, or hey, this was a big deal because now we can do the next thing. What are some of those high watermarks for you?
Yeah, well, I think the big open question or the path that we were trailblazing was that as we thought about more comprehensive diagnostics, doing both DNA, tumor, and germline testing, that's one aspect, but also doing full transcriptome, literally looking at all genes and RNA expression levels of all genes, also capturing things like copy number variation and fusions and things of that nature. But doing that type of 3-part test was not, I would say very popular, right? It wasn't a common thing that most diagnostic companies would do, not just because it adds extra cost, but the open question that wasn't really answered was were any companies going to pay for that de-identified data, right? And if you looked at the market, the answer would be a resounding no, right? Because there was no RNA real world outcomes market. And so that was the big leap of faith that we have to take, is that we believe fundamentally, in order to think about precision medicine, you have to go beyond DNA. It's just a matter of time. There needed to be a company that could get that cold starting problem solved, right? Invest in generating this transcriptomic data at scale, and once you have that scale, it will be apparent to you, like, oh, it's almost a no brainer that it should exist, connected to outcomes, given what we can start to see in how we can subtype patients and how we can see different outcomes emerge based on those molecular subtypes. And so when we were first getting started, many existing customers today have told us no, we had no interest in transcriptomic data. I wouldn't even know what to do with that data. And given the pace of drug development and what we have seen in the data, a lot of those historical customers that were reluctant to invest in things like transcriptomic data are now, right? And it's not just limited to the computational biologists anymore. It's actually it's actually evolved even to clinical development, and even there's this group now called translational epidemiologists, which wasn't a concept before, right? And so now that it exists and there's enough, I would say, successes in drug development that honors that types of complexity, that leverages DNA and RNA, that market has expanded dramatically, or started from zero to now powering, a key part of our data business. And so that was, I would say, if I was to identify any inflection point of the journey, there was we basically had to create a new market, and neither Eric nor I would have told you this is for sure be a market, right? Now it is, and it's actually grown very well, and we've been part of some great drug development programs as a result of it, which has been exciting to see over that journey.
It's interesting to me that you picked that one. I mean, RNA is near and dear to my heart, as most of what I published in grad school and as a postdoc was around transcriptomics, and it's also sort of the founding principle and favorite data type of my company. So, on that, we certainly agree there's real value there. One of my observations is that there have been sort of RNA signatures for ages, 15 years lab technology. I don't remember when the PAM50 signature was published, but people could appreciate it was good at subtyping, but people have struggled to translate that into clinical tools. And I think that the work that Tempus has done has shown that RNA belongs in a clinical context, not just as a research oddity.
Agree, and this is, it's something that being part of sort of these collaborations with, some of the most innovative companies in drug development today, I think that the best companies are actually have found a way to translate that into criteria that they can use in their clinical development strategy. And that doesn't always mean doing RNA sequencing as a companion diagnostic. It could mean that, but it doesn't have to mean. And that's so fascinating to watch in terms of seeing the creativity of these teams that can leverage the data, the real world multimodal data, in saying, okay, how can we capture that PAM50 signature or this other RNA signature and translate it into something that's easier to adopt or easier to enroll or roll out. And that's been pretty exciting to see.
Yeah, no, 100%. A lot of what we're seeing is that you'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't, how many drug developers don't really know how their drug works, right? Like the mechanism of action is not fully understood, or worse, the mechanism of resistance not well understood, right? And I think RNA is really good at giving you some clues around that, and couple it with smart AI, with new algorithms, and just understanding those levers for making decisions about how to develop your drug becomes super critical.
Agree. I think I would say the first chapter of our data business started with really understanding resistance by leveraging things like RNA. And then the natural question is, okay, well, if you understand resistance, okay, well, what can I do about it? Is really where it's next. And so I think that a lot of companies start with that disease understanding or resistance understanding, because historically, the existing data sets from before without RNA, you really couldn't get at the mechanism that was driving that resistance, right? You couldn't associate just a point mutation or a genomic abnormality with resistance. That was more of a correlation rather than anything else. And so It's been really interesting to see that evolve with things like transcriptomics, and it gets even better when you start to compare that multimodal data with other, I would say, more research-oriented data sets that are not coming from the real world, like spatial and single cell. When you leverage those things together and can harmonize them, now you can kinda get, both breadth in terms of breadth of transcriptomic data across key cancer types that you're interested in, but also a depth in, okay, well, leveraging research sequencing, single cell sequencing to go even further to really uncover more than just bulk sequencing and getting, finer resolution.
As Ryan has so adeptly described, AI and multimodal data are changing the future of precision medicine. At Genialis, we are working towards the same future. In fact, Genialis and Tempus recently announced a major collaboration to develop RNA-based biomarker algorithms for cancer treatment. By leveraging Tempus's vast multimodal dataset, we are working to validate accurate, information-rich biomarkers that help physicians and patients make the best possible treatment decisions and help pharma develop better medicines. Want to learn more? Reach out anytime or meet our team at upcoming conferences. Our CTO will be speaking about AI and drug development at Bio Europe in Milan on March 18th. Or come find us at AACR in April, where we will present recent results from our collaboration with Debiopharm Pharmaceuticals, developing biomarkers in the DNA damage response space. To schedule a meeting, just reach out to biomarkers@genialis.com. If you enjoy this show and would like to hear more episodes with more great guests, there's one thing you can do to help. Subscribe, follow us on your favorite podcast streaming service, and leave us a review or comment. Thanks, and now back to the conversation. So you talked about how you've got these two pieces of the business. You've got the testing part, right? So this is sequencing in patients on the behalf of the physicians. The data part, which sounds more geared towards pharma, drug discovery and drug development. But data is, if the analogy is, data is the new oil. Well, you can't run your car on oil. You have to do something to it. You need to refine it. You need to turn it into useful insights. And likewise with tests, what good does it do to find out how the expression level of 40,000 genes unless you can interpret that? So can you speak a little bit about the interpretation or dare I say the algorithm part of all this, the role algorithms play on both sides of the business and the evolution from Tempus Labs to Tempus AI?
Yeah. Well, let me start with the last question first. I mean, we've been working on machine learning since the beginning of the company, and so we've been implementing things around how do you leverage algorithms and machine learning approaches to get more out of the real world data or to call variants and things of that nature. So we've been that's been deeply embedded, and even as an example, we hold the patent for the ability to talk to a laboratory test, to ask it questions, and this was issued before anything around OpenAI was coming out. And so we've been kind of working on this in the background. And so the fact that large language models became front and center and so pervasively used in the industry, not just for broader consumer use, but also in healthcare in particular, was really set us up well for all the things that we've been working on up until that point. And so, rebranding the company was more of a formality than any strategic shift because we've been working on it all along. But what we've been focused on with algorithms and things of that nature, even beyond just processing, turning raw material or oil into refined fuel for various insight, is really back to the first question you asked me, which is really around the mission of the company, really ushering in this kind of new future of AI-enabled diagnostics, which is you can now rethink what a diagnostic could be, and it could just be an algorithm, right? And now what we're really excited about is we've seen the potential in terms of algorithms that we've developed, but also algorithms that others have developed, like you and your company. That's the future that we see, is that so much of the tailored decision making for a patient case or cancer subtype is going to depend upon more specialized models or algorithms that can be applied to really help make the best decision possible. And so we believe that there's going to be a future where there's 2,000 algorithms, and really help doctors understand when do you use the right algorithm for the right use case or the right situation is a new challenge. But that's a future that we're building towards that really is, again, rethinking what a diagnostic could and should be.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'd extend the vision a little further. If you look at, for example, the NCCN guidelines, which are essentially an algorithm manual, right? It's a choose your own adventure guide, if then statements, right? Which are algorithmic. Given NCCN guidelines has something like 5,000 decision points, right? So to collapse that into, a single molecular test where you do the sequencing once and you've got a system of AI agents, a system of algorithms that can make those choices for you, I think moves healthcare in a meaningful way.
Definitely. As we think about sort of every cancer guideline or every sort of decision point along the way, we want to be able to have a system that can present all that information to physicians so that it's not that the algorithm is just going to decide what you should do. No different than NCC doesn't just always decide what you do as a physician. But getting you to that point where you can make trade-off decisions as a doctor is really essential, and that's what we think of the role of technology and people like Tempus AI can really provide is to say, "We've distilled down this case. Here's the fork in the road, and here's what we've seen in the real world based on that fork in the road," right? And that's kind of would be an exciting future to live in.
I want to switch gears a little bit. I'd like to learn a bit more about your other job, about Pathos, the biotech that you helped start and run. And just to put this out there, I've got one company and do this podcast as sort of a hobby, and that's like all I've got time for. And you've got two major companies, including a big publicly traded one, and are currently churning out more good thought leadership and blogs than anyone else, I think, in the business. So I don't know where you find the time. You don't have to tell me how you found extra hours in the day, but I'm curious about that. But I just wanted to give you a round of applause for the productivity. But tell us more about Pathos and how it came about and what you guys are doing there.
Yeah, no, thanks. Pathos was really a manifestation of, when we think about the type of multimodal data sets that we've been able to assemble and are now growing to be one of the largest in oncology, we really started Pathos to really partner with biopharma companies because we noticed that there was this real challenge, this chasm that was forming between phase 1 and phase 2, that 2 main programs were being shelved after or during phase 1, not necessarily because the drug or the compound was bad, but in some cases, it was unclear how to leverage the phase 1 data and the preclinical data to design phase 2 in a way where you can increase the probability of success. Meaning, in the phase 1, we as an industry are generally designing that trial for safety and tolerability. And so we bring in a very broad group of heavily treated patients or even multiple cancer types, and we demonstrate that it's not just safe and tolerable, but we also get really lucky in some cases where certain patients in the phase 1 respond, right? And that's a good thing. But too often, those trials where the signal is not so overwhelmingly clear on how to design that patient selection strategy for the phase 2, right? We have N of 3 responder patients, and we had an idea from preclinical experiments, but still you're having to work off of a very small data set, right? And fortunately, those programs, especially in this biotech market that we live in right now, which has been sort of compressed over the last few years, really makes it hard for companies to prioritize programs when it's unclear or when those patient selection strategies are unclear. And so we really started Pathos even before the biotech crunch hit to say, well, this data set, this multimodal data set is best tuned for understanding things like resistance, like we talked about earlier, but also doing something about it, meaning what patient selection strategy, what biomarkers, or what sort of molecular signatures should we really be focusing on to really design that phase 2 for the optimal success or for success more broadly. And so that was the genesis of the idea. And there needed to be a company that could take on that drug development risk, right? And that's why we started a separate company from Tempus. Tempus is working with hundreds of biopharma companies, thousands of oncologists and thousands of doctors, and it's on a growth path that is very clear that we've talked about publicly and have been on for 10 years. But there needs to be, in my mind, a type of new company that could really do something about this phase 2 problem, because that's where most programs will fail. If you look at the drug development, people know about the $2 billion that's spent and the 9% or 10% success rate. But when you unpack it by phase of development, it's actually the most acute. It's the worst at phase 2, which is about in oncology, it's about 35 to 40% success rate. That is just tragic when you think about it. And if you can use the type of data that we've been able to build at Tempus, and you can use some of the more sophisticated, sort of complex modeling to highlight and prioritize these mechanisms, drivers of resistance, and understanding these mechanisms of action, you could actually focus on optimizing the development plans for existing safe and tolerable drugs that are past the phase 1. And that's what we have been focused on to date. And so we've been fortunate to work with a number of partners where we have acquired rights to their drug to develop it for the phase 2 and beyond. And we demonstrate to them, here's the development strategy that we believe is necessary for your drug, given the MOA and given the data you've already assembled, and also the real world data that we have in indication of interest, right? And so, as an example, one of the first programs that we brought in was a CBP inhibitor that was originally developed by Forma Therapeutics that was acquired by Novo Nordisk. And in this case, it was the same thing I was like we're talking about is that trial, they ran a phase 1. We had patient data, human data showing that it's safe and tolerable, potentially, best in class from a safety perspective. But the big challenge that they were facing is they weren't sure how to stratify metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer in more granular ways to really optimize the response rate, right? They saw some responders in the phase 1. It wasn't clear on how they were going to boost that efficacy in the phase 2. And so as a result, that challenge that Forma faced, but also it's indicative of a lot of programs, often doesn't make it easy to develop those drugs. And so we've been at it for almost 3 years now. And, the intent is to be able to do that and solve the phase 2 problem. If you solve the phase 2 problem, now you can materially bump up the not just the success rate that the 9 or 10% that people are quoting, but you can also, by focusing on phase 2, you can demonstrate whether your models or your predictions or your insight matters in 2 to 3 years, because phase 2s are relatively short compared to starting all the way in discovery, right? So we've been focused on that for a while and have been fortunate to work on some great programs already.
That's a fascinating story. And just to kind of say it differently, you're finding molecules that have their risk profiles are already like partly de-risked because they've gotten through translational, they've gone through phase 1s, or that piece is solved, and you're focused on de-risking, frankly, the riskiest trough. But you've got this amazing data set that allows you to go in with some confidence and pick patient subgroups, pick indications, and so forth. Maybe design smarter trials, enroll through smarter selection. You wrote a blog piece recently that really resonated with me. That was about the economics of drug development, or really the economics of drugs once they get to market, and a fallacy that a lot of companies seem to have, where they shut down programs because they don't perceive a large enough market for that drug. So how do you see Pathos's approach as maybe being contrarian to that sort of faulty common wisdom about, well, the target market's got to be X size?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down, a lot of companies, especially bigger companies, are challenged because they have to deal with different circumstances where they have to grow revenue, but they're measured by growth rate. So their base really matters. So they can't work on something that's, be like 600 million peak year sales if their annual sales is, call it, 20 billion. And so it just doesn't make sense. But even still, I think it just comes down to what is the risk? What does the historical average tell us? And what people are typically doing is they'll discount that market, the peak year sales, for a drug by the success rate that they've seen historically in their pipeline. And so it very quickly, when you take something like 500 million, 600 million peak year sales and you discount it by the success rate that we've seen, call it, 40% success rate in the phase 2, and then another down on top of that, it very quickly doesn't make economic sense. That's assuming you believe that that success rate is true. And so the big open question is whether we can change that success rate in a reliable way, not just for one program, but in a systematic way. And that's something that we're trying out now. So I'm not going to claim victory there, but we are focused on that sole problem, which is if you can solve that success rate problem and you have translated something from 35% success rate to something like 60%, 70%, doubling the success rate, now you can afford to go after smaller markets if that's actually true. And so we talk a lot about internally that we want to follow the data and be patient centric. Whereas if we see patients that are responding to this drug, the real question, and this is where it's the best use of AI in my mind, is that that is a optimization problem. We see good outcomes and bad outcomes, and hopefully AI can optimize more good outcomes than bad outcomes, which is a harder problem in my mind, which is using it come up with something brand new that we don't really know yet. This is something that is rooted in actual responses, and so, uh, these are the things that we put in place, and so when we pursue a program, like, for example, our second program that we brought in, we were working with Prelude Therapeutics, which is a public biotech, and we acquired worldwide rights to their PMT5 inhibitor, and that trial in phase 1 was initially targeting high-grade glioma patients and uveal melanoma patients. Much smaller markets, but arguably very high unmet need. And so if we would have just evaluated it based upon market size, because not just high-grade glioma is small, but we were going after a subgroup within high-grade glioma, so even smaller, it would become very challenging very quickly if you just purely look at it from an economic terms. But what we got very excited about was the signal we were seeing that this was a program that was demonstrating blood-brain penetrance. Patients were having complete response and partial response in something as dire as high-grade glioma. And when you see that, and you can start to use the real-world data that we have, this multimodal data, to say, that here's how you can predict more patients that not only responded in the trial, but also more for your phase 2. Now you can, even though it's a smaller market, if we can compress that time frame to potentially have accelerated approval and get to market, that economic model is just very different than what is thought of traditionally. So we're in it to pursue those types of strategies, and that's why I don't blame existing large companies for doing that. But I do think for newer biotechs, if they try to play the big pharma game, it's going to be very challenging. And so you have to think about playing to your strengths as a biotech in a somewhat different way. But it's our approach is different than thinking about a lead compound or and maximizing the lead. We think about, the systematic approach, leveraging our AI platform to do many of these, have many, 600, 700 million peak year sales drugs, and really thrive with that economic model. And that to us can be a huge growth engine for us in the future.
Again, it makes a ton of sense to me, and I think as a model for biotechs, it makes even more sense still. It's exhausting to see loads of companies going after me too targets with drugs that are hoping to pick up third, fourth, fifth in class for something where patients already have options, right? So going after true novelty is important. But I suspect that this thesis is important not just for Pathos, but also for Tempus, because you mentioned some pharma companies are just unconvinced. What am I going to do with an RNA biomarker in the clinic? And, we hear pushback from time to time that's like, well, we don't want to risk limiting our patient population. And I think that's another fallacy, frankly. I think this idea of, well, if our drug's only going to work for a third of the patients, why would we want to know that? And it's mind boggling, right? And so convincing the world that being able to pick your patients and de-risk phase 2 that way is good economics, I think is also important work that Tempus and Pathos are doing on the rest of our behalf.
Yeah, and you asked the question, like, how do I find time to do all these things? So I only do them because it's actually at the intersection of all of these things, right? So I write and talk a lot about what we're doing at Pathos because we don't want it to be a secret. We want actually everyone that has a compound that can work really well for a subgroup to use the type of data that Tempus has, to take these approaches to get those to the market, right? Because that's the best thing for patients in general, and it could be a good thing for the pharma company or the biotech as well, because they could start to create value so they can invest in the next thing. And so writing about it and doing this, what Pathos is up to, and this is why we say we partner with so many companies where they're stuck between, we have a compound that's stuck between phase 1 and phase 2, is that if you demonstrate how to do that, then the industry, I think, will start to just do that more often for those types of compounds. And so our hope is that it could be a start of the future, but we'll have to wait and see, once we get there.
I certainly hope that it is. That's a great note to wrap up the questions. I've got one last one, which I ask everyone. If Tempus is about 10 years old, if you do your job right at Tempus and at Pathos 10 years from now, how does medicine look different?
Yeah, no, I think in the future, really sort of embodying this future of AI-enabled diagnostics is something that I'm hope comes true based upon everything that we're putting in now, but also not just in oncology, but also in things like cardiology. So I didn't really even talk about cardiology, but doing similar things where you can build an algorithm that sits on top of existing clinical information like an EKG, where you can screen patients that in our software as a medical device we've demonstrated with clinical validity that we can predict patients that are likely to develop AFib in 1 year. And that time frame is important because now as a physician or as a care team, I can do something about it. It's actionable. If we are going in the right direction and we do our job, we believe that those types of algorithms and those types of approaches will exist for many diseases, right? And so we've demonstrated how we can go across other diseases, but investing in this data infrastructure to make those things happen and to power those types of models and to deploy those models is really the future that we're embarking on. And so we hope that when physicians think about care in 10 years from now, that they're not asking, okay, well, what type of test should I order and what sales rep do I need to talk to? And, the conventional measures, there should be sort of a system to help them think about the various things that they should be evaluating for their patient case. And not only for what test to order, but also what treatments and care management to think about going forward. And we believe that that future is coming, and we're excited to not just be part of it, but to partner with great organizations that want to build future algorithms and future applications for that new future and be sort of that infrastructure that can make those things come to life. And so we're excited to invest further there to build better data connections, to deliver more value to our health systems, but also to work with great companies to bring those applications and those algorithms to life across the ecosystems that we work with.
Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat about this today. I think Tempus has really built an ecosystem that will be super important in the precision medicine future that we're envisioning. I'm rooting for Pathos. It's a business model and a drug development model I believe in as well. And again, thanks for taking the time and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, Raf. Take care.
This has been another episode of the Talking Precision Medicine podcast, brought to you by Genialis. Hopefully by now you've subscribed to the show, but if not, go ahead and click that subscribe button and leave us a review. And please do pay us a visit at www.genialis.com. That's www.genialis.com to learn more about how AI is transforming precision medicine. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.